Hello and welcome to episode 108 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have a banger between Toronto and Atlanta that lived up to the hype and also spilled over into Twitter, which, as we've talked about many times, COD Twitter remains undefeated. And we will get to a bunch of these other matches that happened over the past week and also give our predictions for the next week of CDL matches. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. It was definitely an interesting weekend of matches. Definitely a shorter one, though. One of those ones that we've had a little recently where not as many matches as usual, but it's what we're dealing with. So just another week of online COD, and I like what you said about COD Twitter remaining undefeated, because that certainly seems to be the case once again.
So we started off the matches this past weekend. We had two matches on Friday, both of them very quick 3-0s. When you only have two matches and they both end up going three maps, that is about as short of a work day as the CDL crew probably gets. So the first match was Atlanta FaZe versus the Minnesota Rocker. FaZe wins 3-0, and then the Toronto Ultra in the second match of the day, they swept the Seattle Surge. Anything jump out to you in either of these matches? Because, I think it was expected for both of us, that Atlanta and Toronto would win. Since the major, at least, those have been the top two teams, at least in my eyes, and I think in yours as well. And Minnesota had not won a match to this point. Seattle had also not won a match to this point. So it was kind of the big dogs versus the little chihuahuas, so to speak, going into this.
Yeah, I think this is a rare instance here. We've talked at length this season about there being like 3-0 sweeps that if you look at the individual map scores, they look like super close on paper, and it doesn't necessarily stick out that it was a 3-0. But this was a 3-0 where kind of the opposite, where the individual map scores were close, but it really didn't feel like it was a close match in particular, talking about Atlanta, Minnesota here. We have, it was 250, 193 in the hard point, a 6-4 in the search, and a 3-2 in control. 3-2 in control is kind of like whatever at this point. It's kind of like, if the control's not a 3-2, that's more surprising than it actually being a 3-2.
Mm-hmm.
But, you look at the numbers for this series, the highest KD on Minnesota was a 0.79, and everybody was positive for Atlanta. So it really was like, it was, despite the individual map scores, this was a dominant performance out of FaZe, and it really stood out to me in the first map. Drazah was using a sub for a majority of Rio, at least based on what I was watching. It felt like for most of the map he was on the rival 9, and he was performing exceptionally well on that, so I thought that was interesting. Rio, I still haven't got a chance to play it myself, but definitely one of the smaller maps. And that kind of goes back to what we were saying months now ago when Drazah was brought into this lineup. It seemed like FaZe was wanting to have Celium on the main AR and Drazah on the flex, but just because of Celium's ability to be a quote-unquote flex as well, like Rio could be a map for FaZe if the meta plays out this way. They could run 4 subs on that map, and they're confident in all 4 of those players on a sub. So seeing Drazah play well with the sub in the map 1 really stood out to me there. And then in map 2, pretty interesting turn of events where Abizi just seemingly out of nowhere flipped a switch and went on a 10-kill streak. People were debating there was an 11th kill with the cruise missile, but that doesn't technically count for the kill streak because kill streaks don't count for your kill streak total. So 10-11 streak, depending on where you're at. But afterwards, the round where his streak comes to an end, the Iceman himself, Accuracy, gets another ninja defuse. Seemingly at this point, I think Simp was the last one alive, if I remember correctly. I feel like if you know Accuracy is the last player alive with the bombs planted, you almost have to instinctually feel like he might be going for a ninja.
Mm-hmm.
the accuracy could probably play mind games at that point and like kind of just bait it out and hope somebody on the other team overextends to check for the ninja and then he kills them because he's not. But at the same time, you can play the double reverse psychology of, well, they're just not going to check because they don't think I'm going to go for another ninja, right? Well, he did, and he pulled another one off. So that was kind of cool there. Probably really the only main highlight for Minnesota in this series, but it was we kind of highlighted going into this, despite FaZe's loss in the previous week leading up to this one to New York. We were kind of saying, Minnesota hadn't won a qualifier yet. They were gonna, if they were able to pull off an upset, it might be a red flag for Atlanta, back-to-back losses there, but obviously that's not the case, and they looked like the FaZe we've come to know and love over the years. So strong performance out of them to kick off this week.
Yeah, Atlanta has always been kind of the motto of consistency, at least in the CDL era. We've had dynasties and really consistent teams over the years, but FaZe, at least since the CDL started before the 2020 season, they have been year in and year out the best. From the beginning to the end of the season. It doesn't always work out for champs, but I think in general it's worked out for them overall. And with Minnesota, I think it was just interesting, and I figured I'd bring it up that Accuracy said that he actually broke his pinky finger playing basketball before this series. So maybe that is a tainted win for FaZe. Maybe they wouldn't have done it. It would actually been a 3-0 Minnesota win if Accuracy hadn't broken his pinky. So
I saw FaZe's reply that they did like a meme afterwards with like an X-ray in the middle finger, but I don't know. I mean, obviously I'm not like an X-ray technician or anything, but I didn't really see anything with that pinky that was like weird. Maybe I'm just stupid, but it didn't look like like maybe I was looking in the wrong places. So I was confused by that. But obviously, if that is an actual injury that actually he's going to have to deal with, we'll have to keep tabs on that to see if it does affect his play going forward.
I also am an idiot, and I'm not a doctor or anything, but it looks like the kind of the top of his like pinky, like near the fingertip, it looks like that's almost like shifted to the side, like it's kind of like crooked, and it's not as connected. Okay. But I mean, I also don't know. I would imagine like no matter if it was broken or not, it would be just really painful to try to play on a controller, especially. But I don't think it actually had any real effect on this because, like you said, he pulled off a ninja defuse, and they did have decently close maps, but FaZe is just a much better team, and Minnesota in general is just kind of a mess right now, and maybe that's just kind of a trend that they are setting in the qualifiers. Granted, they did kind of turn it around last time, but they just are not looking very, very strong right now. A team that is looking very strong, at least at this point, was Toronto. They won 3-0 against Seattle. The Surge, they now have the longest control losing streak in CDL history, according to Breaking Point, which is an incredible record. It feels like every year we have a new team kind of set some kind of record. I think FaZe had like the longest like S&D win streak for a little bit. Obviously, we had the Paris Legion, I think at one point had the longest total losing streak in CDL history, and now Surge, they lost 11 straight controls, setting a new CDL record. I mean, that's a cool thing. It's better to be like historically bad than just kind of like kind of forgettable bad. The people remember the Detroit Lions and the Cleveland Browns going 0-16. You don't really remember a team going 2-14 or 3-13. So anything that stood out to you during this Ultra Surge series?
No, I think this was pretty much expected. The only thing we had really talked about last week, I feel like, was the potential for the potential for Seattle to maybe sneak in a search, but obviously their search hasn't been the same without Illy in the roster, and Toronto's been Toronto, so really not anything too super surprising here. Kleenex had a really strong series, 1645 for a 1.33 KD. Aristides actually had posted a positive KD at 42 and 36, only one on his team. But I think that is, yeah, it's tied for the fewest kills on Seattle with Abuza at 42. Rezi had 46 and Hook had 51, but they were both negative. So that's kind of a strange stat line there. But um, nonetheless, yeah, I think this was the expected result, despite what happens for both of these teams later on in the week.
Yeah, definitely. And we will get to that. Saturday, March 2nd, we actually had 3 matches, and we had at least one series go to a fourth map, which is very nice. The first did not. Vegas versus Boston, and the Vegas Legion are, at least at this point, they're hot. They're on a little bit of a win streak. I'm not tooting my own horn, but I think I picked them, a few times in a row now. So
You
I
did.
I think they're playing in my spirit. But they beat the Boston Breach, which I think was kind of a big win for them, just to kind of show, it was a good litmus test for both of these teams to see where they are with these new rosters. In Vegas, they come out on top. What did you think of Vegas's win? Because obviously, like, any win for the Legion is kind of like a big thing, especially when they're trying to climb their way out of the bottom four.
All I'm thinking right now is, that Vegas is. Did they play a second match on
I
Sunday? They
don't
didn't.
think
So
so.
at the end of this week, Vegas is sitting at 3-1. I don't know off the top of my head the last time Vegas had 3 wins in a qualifier. Now, obviously, there's more qualifiers this time around,
Yeah.
this year than before, but I don't even remember any off the top of my head because there was only 5 in previous years. So like 3-2, they would have been in the winners bracket, and obviously Vegas/Paris has started a lot of tournaments in the losers bracket. So
Yeah.
um, not entirely sure, but this potentially, even if they lose their next 3 matches, then they go 3-4, it might be their best set of online qualifiers in quite some time. And if
Mhm.
they win, let's just say if they win one more, or even 2, I wouldn't even hesitate to think it's their best online qualifier, since potentially like that one in the inaugural year where they made it to um the championship of the
The
whatever,
home
what was it called,
series.
home, yeah, thank you, I couldn't think of the word. um so yeah, the Vegas is winning champs crew might have some slivers of hope here, but you
Boston,
know
not so
you know
much.
I mean, it certainly looked like in map one in particular, that could have been a deciding factor where, it looked like Boston was going to be able to get the map one win, but then on that diner hill on Karachi Hardpoint, Vegas put together a little bit of a streak. I think it was like I think it was like 240 to 200, so maybe like a 40-point comeback, something in that ballpark, where Vegas was able to get a hold on the diner hill, keep Boston out of the hill, and just close things out there. I feel like we've seen that a lot in maps, or especially Karachi Hardpoint. I feel like a lot of Karachis have been ending on that diner hill in similar situations. Um, but yeah, that was obviously a big one there, and it gets Vegas off on the right foot. They take the search, another 3-2 in the control. So impressive win out of Vegas. They've gotten my attention for sure now, and I haven't looked too far ahead to see who they're playing against. They got one match next week, and it's a pretty winnable one. Not going to spoil it, but we could be looking at a Vegas turnaround here, which is definitely interesting considering where they started the year. Especially, we talked about Purge and his land debut having a, statistically pretty poor debut there. Now they bring in Geo. Looks like things might be turning around. So, gonna keep my eyes on Vegas for sure for the rest of these qualifiers and at Major 2. Might seems like so far they've put themselves in a good position to potentially start the event in the winners bracket.
It also seems that Attach is kind of setting up for another like all-star level season that, like he had with Minnesota, where even though they weren't, a great team or anything, he was kind of recognized as like, oh yeah, he's had an incredible season. According to Breaking Point, he has the 7th highest overall KD in the league. He's top 15 in hardpoint and control, and he has the number 1 search and destroy KD in the entire league
Wow.
with a 1.35. So, and obviously, like, he is one of the best AR players in the league. He has been, like, last year was not a great season overall, but he's a super talented player, and I think he was huge in this S&D. He dropped 12 kills. He went 12-4. Snoopy dropped 12 for the loss, which definitely would not feel nice. But Vegas looking very good. We'll kind of see how they do against a little bit better competition as they continue on, and that'll be a good test for them. Next match was Optic versus Carolina, the first match and one of only 2 matches all weekend that went to a 4th map, which is just crazy. So Optic, they end up winning the series 3-1, but a storyline that we talked about for the last few weeks, Carolina and their search and destroy, they were able to win the search in this series 6-1 on High Rise to take their only map of the series. It wasn't particularly close on any of the other the respawn maps. It was like a 50-60 point advantage in hardpoint and a 3-0 in control for Optic. So any kind of hope that you have for Carolina now that you've seen them win in search and destroy against one of the best teams in the league in Optic?
I still can't get a read for that. The Carolina search and destroy situation. It feels like that's all I've been talking about really with Carolina, but they had that match against Seattle where they win 3-1, they win all the respawns, and they lose the search to Seattle. But then they had that match against Boston, which I think was before it. I'm trying to scroll through and I'm struggling here, but I believe their match against Boston in these qualifiers, it was the first match or one of the first matches.
Yeah, they beat them.
They
6-4.
only win this. Yeah, they only win the search,
Mhm.
and they lose the respawns, which is what happens here. So, I don't really have a good sense of what's going on there. I mean, obviously, it seems like the search is at least improving, and that's kind of something I've mentioned now several times on the podcast, just based on the players on this team having search and destroy background, that it makes sense that the squad is able to figure search out. So I guess that is a positive for this match. But yeah, this is one you just don't expect Carolina to really win. Optic, take control of business in the respawns. Shotzi in particular was playing exceptionally well. Dropped 37 map 1 and 43 map 4. I think I saw Crone or Breaking Point tweet that it was the hard point record for this season, but not, somebody must have had more in the control. I can't remember. But yeah, and then just for I don't have another exact number here. This is just another gut feeling, but I feel like the amount of times I've written Gwyn had an absurd amount of kills for the loss. This is another one. In map 1 here, he dropped 35 for the L. I feel like I've written that in the notes. 5+ times now this season. So Gwyn's still playing well, and he ends this series with the only positive KD on Carolina, 87 and 77 overall. He was only behind Shotzi in kills, which Shotzi drops 99, which is just absurd. But second most kills in the series in a losing effort. Tough one, but Gwyn's at least playing well and definitely playing himself into the conversation of Rookie of the Year, as long as we're seemingly in that world where it doesn't seem like a rookie might win a championship at this point. So it's going to be more stats based than team based potentially, and that could be a way for Gwyn to slip into the Rookie of the Year if he keeps playing well despite Carolina struggling, or if who knows, maybe Carolina turn things around. Gwyn starts or keeps doing what he's been doing, and then takes takes the trophy in a landslide. But yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself there.
There is a noticeable difference in the S&D, at least in the win-loss records for Carolina. So before this qualifier set, they were 2-11 in search. Granted, different rosters, Godorex and part of that, Real and part of that, TJ and part of that, Fellow and part of that. But since the qualifiers have started, they are 3-2 in search. So they've already won more S&D maps in the last 3-4 weeks than they had the entire season to this point. So I think that is a massive improvement. Granted, that's only 5 maps. We'll see how it kind of bears out as we get toward the end of these qualifiers, and obviously it's more important when we get to LAN with the Miami major, because that's going to be the biggest place that they can pick up points. But it does seem like there is a difference so far with Carolina search. We'll see how that continues to play out. Seattle versus LAG in the final match of Saturday, another 3-0, but this one is more surprising considering Seattle had not won a match with Brezzy in the lineup in place of Illy to this point. We both picked LAG. I think it's a pretty reasonable pick because I think I said I'm not going to pick Seattle until they prove that they can actually win. And then they actually won respawns. Specifically, they won control, ending their CDL record losing streak in that game mode. So now I think it's more, I'm open to the possibility of picking Seattle, even if I'm not super comfortable with it. But I don't know whether it says more about Seattle winning than it, or it does LAG losing this series. What do you say? Is this a bad loss for LAG or a big win for Seattle?
Oh, it's both. I think both is correct. I want you to remember what you just said about picking Seattle in about a half hour when we get to the predictions for this upcoming week, because it's gonna put your willingness to pick Seattle to the test, I feel like. But nonetheless, yeah, this was definitely a surprising one to me. Again, this is like the LAG situation now, and I'm really not too sure what to make of the squad, just because we've seen flashes. They've had some close games against the big dogs in the early qualifiers, especially in the Major 1 qualifiers when people really weren't expecting anything out of them. And now it feels like, you're kind of expecting LAG to be in like that, 6th through 9th position, sort of like middle of the pack or a little less than middle of the pack, where they should be beating the lower teams. And it doesn't seem like it's working out that way, at least in this set of qualifiers for LAG, now 0-3. So I'm not really sure what's going on there, but definitely was not expecting a 3-0 here. Had another Karachi hardpoint comeback at the end in map 1 that ended on the Diner Hill, kind of like I was just talking about in the Vegas-Boston match. And then, yeah, like you said, they're able to get a control win after setting the record there, according to Breaking Point. And interesting one there was also, according to Breaking Point, that Luke set a record for the most first bloods in an S&D at 6, which is kind of impressive. It didn't go to 11 rounds, so the fact he got 6 first bloods in 10 rounds is also impressive, because it's one less round than the max. If he did it, you get 6 first bloods in 6 rounds, that's obviously the best you can do. But I guess this is just slightly lower than the maximum potential round, so it's definitely interesting. Also has me thinking, like, what's some of the people, like we think about first blood guys, we think of someone like a BZ, like what's the most first bloods he's gotten in a map? Because I feel like he's got to have like 4 or 5 in some maps where he's just absolutely on a tear. But shout out to Hook there, and I guess shout out Seattle for pulling off a win when definitely seemingly a lot of people were not expecting them to, even if it was against LAG.
Yeah, I think Seattle was 2-12 in control heading into this, while LAG was 5-8. I don't know. I also don't know what to make of LAG. I think we both agree that they aren't we knew that they weren't the most talented roster. We weren't thinking that they were going to be, a championship level team or anything, but this is a really bad loss. Maybe you could just chalk it up as, okay, it's an online match. We had a bad day, whatever. But at a certain point, they probably should make a roster change. I think maybe wait till after Major 2, see what happens there. But they're getting to a point where they're falling behind, and they're kind of losing the ground that they had built up in the first place. So that it seems kind of weird to keep this roster intact.
It's also a question of whether they will pay to potentially make a roster change, or if this is just a situation due to the organizational situation where they might be stuck with this roster. But I think they have a sub signed. I think it's Flames.
Yeah.
So maybe they're able to make a swap there if things continue to go poorly. But yeah, we'll have to see if LAG is able to turn things around or not.
For sure. 3 matches on Sunday. 2 of them also were sweeps. The first, not very surprising at all. New York swept Miami. There's really not much to say. Miami dropped to 0-5. New York improved to 5-0. The search was reasonably close, but the respawns were not. Hydra 1.74 KD in this series. Metals 0.57. So it was kind of there was a disparity in talent. I would just say that. Any thoughts, opinions on one of the more predictable series of this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I still just don't quite know what to make out of the Heretics. It's really, since those major one qualifiers, things haven't been the same. Even with the changes, the big thing that jumps out to being 0-5 here is the very likely scenario where they're going to be starting their own major from the losers bracket, which Boston just did a month ago. It's just not a situation you want to be in, especially Miami, technically the first event they've hosted. I don't think Florida hosted an event when it was the Mutineers.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think the last one would have been the Champs there in Orlando.
Yeah.
It's been a while, because I don't think they had a home series before it moved to online in MW. But that, regardless, is definitely the first event for Miami since the rebrand. And just start, especially if they go in 0-7, like that's just not a great look. So, the only silver lining, I just pulled it up, and we could kind of talk about it later. But as it sits right now, Carolina and Seattle are 1-3, tied for 8th and 9th. And then LAT and Boston are in 6th, 7th with 2 wins. So in some crazy, super weird scenario where we haven't really seen it before, where just a lot of teams are struggling, there could be some tiebreakers where 2-5 somehow gets Miami the 8th spot, but definitely not seeming super likely.
Mm-hmm.
There's another team now sitting at 0-5 that we'll get to in a couple minutes. And even that team is at 8-15 for a map count, whereas Miami is 5-15, so they don't even have that going in their favor. So seems like almost a certainty at this point that Miami's going to be in the losers bracket to start their major, which just, for those fans and the team isn't where they want to be. But we'll have to see. If we haven't really seen any drastic improvements since the addition of Eric Boom. So it becomes a question now. We kind of brought it up. They signed Real as a sub. Maybe we see him get thrown in. But don't really know what's going to go on there. We're going to have to wait and see if there's anything else from Miami. But another dominant performance from New York, who are now 5-0, complete opposite of Miami.
Like it's a little early, but I think it should just be on the radar. Miami has lost 7 in a row. I think the record is 11 or 12 by the Legion in 2022. So I'm not saying that it's happening, but there's a decent chance that they lose their last 2 qualifiers. They probably lose their major match, which would put them at that would put them at 8. Or no, that would put them at 10. Then who knows what happens? Like I'm not like saying that we should just declare it as it's going to happen, but I'm saying we should be aware that this is a possibility that we are approaching it. But yeah, it's bad. I need to, for next week's episode, just kind of pull together the combined records of the teams that Miami has beaten this season, because it's like they beat LAG, who's bad. They beat Optic, who's good. They beat Minnesota, who hasn't won since the major. They beat Vegas, who is possibly better, and then they beat Carolina, who is not good. So
I can tell you real quick. It was Optic is 11-5.
Okay.
You said Minnesota, right? Is 5-11.
Okay.
So that's 6-16 or 16-16.
Yeah.
Who was the third team?
LAG.
LAG is 4-10, so that's 20-30.
Yeah. That's 20 and 26.
Sorry, yes.
And so LAG, Optic, Minnesota.
Yep.
Vegas.
Vegas is 5-8, so that's 25-34.
And then Carolina.
Carolina's 3-10, so 28 and 44.
So just an incredible collection, and Optic is really carrying that. Like
That's
11 of the 28 wins come from Optic alone. Um, so the other teams have 5 wins, 4 wins, 5 wins. And they caught them earlier in the season.
that's true too. Yeah.
Like LAG hasn't made a roster change, Minnesota hasn't made a roster change, but Vegas did. Carolina has made multiple now. I don't know, like I just think it's very weird. I think I thought the team would be better than this. Obviously, like I thought I wasn't. We talked about the top 4 teams. Those were the top 4. There really wasn't much debate, but there was like a lot of unknowns, 5 through 12. I thought Miami might be like 8, 9, kind of like on the edge of champs qualification. But the way that they're trending, they will almost like if they keep doing this, they won't even be close to qualifying for champs because they're gonna like they've lost matches to Vegas. They 2 matches to Vegas in this losing streak. They lost to LAT, which is just a bad loss in general usually. So I don't really know what to make of them other than they're bad, and we'll see how bad they can be, or if Real comes in, maybe that'll kind of salvage what they have. But it's pretty disappointing so far for Miami. To shift gears, we actually had 2 good teams play each other in this next match, the second match of Sunday. It's a little weird that this wasn't the final match on Sunday to kind of close out the week. But Atlanta versus Toronto, the 2 best teams in my estimation, but the result was not something that I think really many people expected. Even if you're a big FaZe supporter, and we've picked FaZe probably 98% of the time on this show, and of course we pick them, pick against them, and Toronto ends up losing this series 3-0. A really surprising result considering how dominant Toronto has looked, and Toronto had beaten FaZe at the major. What do you think about this? Obviously, it went to round 11 in search, so that's obviously it's kind of like a coin flip in those scenarios. But it wasn't particularly close in hardpoint. It didn't go to round 5 in control, and we'll get to all the stuff that kind of happened afterwards. But what did you think about Atlanta pulling off this upset, even if FaZe having an upset is weird by itself?
Yeah, I mean that was the big takeaway for me right away. Is just I should have known better than to pick against FaZe. I've preached it enough times on this podcast that I can't really pick against them, and I went against myself, and they made me pay for it. But in all seriousness, no, definitely an impressive performance out of FaZe. One, even if you told me FaZe was going to beat Toronto, I definitely wouldn't have expected it to be in 3-0 fashion like this. And especially coming off of FaZe's match last week where they lost to New York, losing 2 searches. It kind of was like a situation in my head where I'm just like, I don't really know what the path to victory for Atlanta would be in a potential quote unquote upset. But to kick things off, Atlanta gives Toronto their 3rd hardpoint loss in the entire season, which is pretty remarkable. And I believe the broadcast said it was Toronto's first loss on Karachi hardpoint in particular. So that definitely stood out to me. And yeah, just overall, it was a close search. Played on Rio, so that's obviously a factor. Where Rio wasn't in the map pool when we saw these teams play at Major 1, so maybe that could throw off the series or throw it in Atlanta's favor going forward. Maybe now Toronto has to veto that against them. It was 6-5, so maybe they're still comfortable playing on it. Just the round 11 didn't go their way, but either way, that's something you got to keep an eye on as the map pool changes. Potentially could change the vetoes and all that good stuff for the next time these 2 teams play. But yeah, that definitely did not expect a 3-0, but was a strong performance out of FaZe, and they certainly were able to talk some trash afterwards, especially Drazah.
Yeah, so Drazah and Scrappy, I don't know, probably the most antagonistic CDL players since Ake's retirement. Maybe there are some people that I'm forgetting that really like to stir it up, but these two players in particular are kind of like, I don't know, they're just always kind of sour. They're always kind of in a they're very competitive and they like to talk trash. Well, when they do it together, it's kind of like a nuclear bomb goes off. It's just like the reaction is almost too big. Things being said about people's girlfriends. The I think in just general, because I don't like to like I kind of like to watch people get messy on Twitter, and that's kind of what happened. But I don't really care to talk about it all that much. I just love that we have players still that embrace just being like nasty to each other. Like it's not a like the CDL notoriously a friendship league. I think we all kind of agree that to a certain extent, guys are friendly with each other despite playing against each other a lot. These guys are not, and I love that because part of the reason that I got so into competitive Call of Duty was the rivalry aspect. I got into it as like an optic fan because like most people, you get into it like through nade shot videos or like scump videos or whatever. So, and I was a big timer fan, so that helped. But eventually, I grew out of that and I became a complexity guy. I became an Aches guy, and
Ah,
Aches and nade shots rivalry and Aches just having this antagonistic relationship with pretty much every single CDL or competitive COD player at some point. Like that really helped me get like really into the competitive aspect of these players. And that's been kind of missing because we don't really have these organizations right now that are driving that forward. Like we used to have like Envy, Optic,
yeah.
Complexity, Farico at one point. Curse was a thing in the old days, like Curse LV and Curse NY. Like I remember these organizations, and you could kind of get into it. I feel like the CDL brands are just like so kind of whatever. They're kind of mediocre in that way. They don't really have like the history of these organizations, but these players kind of are driving it forward still. Like Scrappy, he's just trying to start stuff with pretty much every player that he beats. We had this stuff with Clayster at the beginning of the season, which is just a fun thing because Clay is known to also be kind of like aggressive and loud about it. And now we have Drazah, who was notorious about picking fights with FaZe when he was on LAT, and now he's on Atlanta, and he's now picking fights with other teams. I don't know if you had any thoughts because I'm kind of rambling a bit, but I just like that we have some kind of animosity between players, even if it is going too far and like too personal. Like I want it to be more of like competitive based, but it's still nice that there's some kind of competitive rivalry here.
No, yeah. I mean, most longtime listeners of the pod should know my thoughts on Aches, one of my favorite players of all time. So, I was obviously not super excited when he left the scene just due to the loss of that personality. And I don't think anyone will ever be able to fill his shoes completely to the capacity that he was able to fill that villain role so notoriously throughout his career. But certainly Scrappy in particular, and I guess Drazah over the last couple of years more so. But Scrappy lately, both of them have to some extent been the new age villains and unafraid to talk trash, kind of like you were saying.
Yeah.
So I definitely appreciate that when it is not taking things too far, crossing any lines, going into personal lives, all that stuff. You keep it to uh on server, talking about the game, that sort of stuff. Like, haha, I beat you guys at champs. Like, I got more champs rings than you. I've got more
Yeah.
prize money than you. Yada yada, stuff like that. Like, that's all cool, fun. Different variations of it. But you start getting personal and stuff. That's where it crosses the line. We don't need that. But um, definitely, if this is any indication of there potentially being any real animosity between Drazah and Scrappy going forward, I think it's only going to elevate these matches between this Toronto and FaZe team or the
Yeah.
two of them throughout the rest of their careers going forward. So that's potentially exciting. I can just picture in my head whichever one of these teams we see them at Major 2. If Toronto beats Atlanta, Scrappy getting up yelling and across the stage at Drazah, and then vice versa if FaZe when Drazah gets up shouting across the stage. So um yeah, I think that element outside again of anything crossing the line and getting too personal, that stuff is definitely exciting and kind of like you said, I think that's just an element of Call of Duty esports that makes Call of Duty esports what it is. Like you don't there's no, I mean, maybe it happens in like China and Korea and League of Legends, but I don't really think so just because of the culture difference.
Yeah.
Um
I don't see Faker doing this.
but yeah, that's what I'd like. Like you don't really see this in any other esport. Like even like maybe Counter Strike, you'll see like some trash talk and stuff, but nothing is quite like COD Twitter, like we were saying
Yeah.
earlier, and it just takes it to a whole nother level. So, um, yeah, I just think end of the day, this could set the stage up for even more epic matchups and a potential rivalry between these two for years to come, no matter what teams they're playing on, or any sort of thing like that. So uh, definitely caught my attention, and I think it caught the attention of a lot of people.
Yeah, I don't know what it is about the culture of like console esports specifically because it, Call of Duty definitely Gears of War when it was a thing was,
Yeah,
almost identical to what Call of Duty did. Halo to an extent has, kind of the same culture as well. So I'm not sure what it is about the console esports that kind of differentiate itself from the PC, the majority PC stuff. But it's an incredible thing to see, especially between championship rivals. The Scrappy Clayster stuff, like that's kind of fun, but like Carolina's not, competing with Toronto in that sense. Like Carolina's not a championship caliber team, whereas Atlanta and Toronto are definitely championship caliber teams. And we also have to take into account that you have Scrappy and Kismet, they have that beef from champs last year where yeah, and we have, obviously the last few seasons we've had Drazah on LAT poking fun at Atlanta and Slasher, and that kind of rivalry is, essentially dissipated because Drazah was like, I can win championships with Atlanta, but we have these teams that really seem to not like each other very much at the very top of the league, and hopefully that will kind of drive the league and the competition and the interest in the league by fans would drive that forward.
and it's funny you mentioned Kismet too. We had a little bit of a dashy stir in the pot on Sunday yesterday, where Dashy tweeted at Kismet, "Hey Kiz, did you hear what Drazah said in his post-match interview by chance?" And I think it was a clip of like him saying like kind of like it's just FaZe and Toronto at the top or something along those lines, obviously paraphrasing. And
Mm.
obviously New York just beat Atlanta, and and Kismet goes, "I back beef. They shot my body map 3. I won that. Now I'm ass." Noted with the Darth Vader gif. Um so we could, maybe it's a little love triangle, for lack of a better word, between Kismet, Drazah, and Scrappy in terms of trash talk. But I'm here for all of it, and I guess shout out Dashy for being a little bit of an instigator here and giving us that.
Yeah. I mean, some players just don't talk that much trash. Like, Simp kind of wades into it a little bit, but never to the extent that, like, Drazah or Scrappy will. I don't think any of the Optic guys really get into it. Obviously, Dashy kind of instigating on Twitter, but yeah, it doesn't seem like it's in their nature. But we need more of it. We need it to continue because that's kind of like the spirit of Call of Duty in general. I think Adam Apicella, the former like head of MLG, or he's talked about it before that he wants it to come back to kind of what it used to be, of like smaller venues, like more intimate, is more like kind of competitive in a sense, to have that where we don't really have that on online except for Twitter, and that's kind of the beauty of COD Twitter. It's connecting us even when we have to sit through online qualifiers for 3.5 months essentially. But the last match of the day. Oh, so we go from two of the best teams in the league to two of the worst teams, at least LAT kind of making their way up, but Minnesota versus LAT. LAT wins this series, which is incredible because LAT has obviously been. I think they were like the last place team in the league to this match, and Minnesota. I think they started in fourth place at the beginning of these qualifiers. So how the mighty have fallen, even though I don't necessarily consider Minnesota all that mighty. But LAT, they win this series 3-2. They win a hard point, which was obviously a very big deal when they were on their big losing streak. And they win both of the search and destroys, which I think is interesting because, obviously accuracy, we, look at him as the Iceman, especially in search and destroy. And it didn't work out at all. Pretty dominant S&D wins from LAT. So LAT are now 2-1 in the qualifiers. Minnesota drops to 0-5. You did lay out a scenario where a team that is 0-5 could theoretically get, a win or two and via tiebreaker get out of the losers bracket. Whether Minnesota does that, we'll see. But yeah. What popped out to you? Because LAT being 2-1 after winning, I think, 2 or 3 matches the entire season to this point, that seems like a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I will say, not to take any credit away from LAT so far with this new roster, but you can obviously see here Minnesota being 0-5 after this one and LAT being 2-1. We still have 4 matches to see from this new LAT team. And them being 2-1, their 2 wins are 3-2 victories over Miami and Minnesota, who are both 0-5. Yeah. So I still need to see more from this new LAT squad. Their loss was a 3-0 loss to Optic. So, really not a very great sample size out of this squad. Obviously, the thing that stands out for LAT so far in the limited sample sizes, they've already won more hard points with this new squad than the other one, because now they have 2 hard point wins, I believe, and they were 1-9, 1-10, 1-11, whatever it was that we've said multiple times now with the other squad. So already literally doubled their hard point wins on the season with this new roster. And then it was, Nadeshot had a tweet there, and during the match when LAT went up 2-0, giving a need shot guarantee that they'll win the series. And Minnesota takes maps 3 and 4. Things got a little shaky. It almost felt like Nade Shot was just basically setting himself up to jinx his own team, which is definitely an interesting strategy. But end of the day, LAT were able to clutch up despite the Iceman having another clutch. I don't think it was a Ninja, but there was a 1v3 in the game 5. But Kremp ended up getting a 1v2 himself in the final round to close it out 6-3 there. So, yeah, just a pretty interesting series. Again, this was one we kind of felt like Minnesota was going to take. Just, again, haven't seen a lot of the new LAT squad. And I know I said it last time. I think you were in agreement with me, though, that it felt like if Minnesota was going to turn the corner on this thing, similar to what they did in the Major 1 qualifiers, this was the match where they were going to do it, as opposed to earlier in the week against Atlanta. But yeah, now different storyline for them here, where they were 0-4 Major 1 qualifiers, are able to turn that around and translate it into a 4th place finish at Major 1. Now they're going from 0-4 to 0-5. Could be looking at a winless stage. Who really knows at this point? But certainly not where Minnesota wanted to be, especially where there were some questions. I don't want to say there were a ton, but I know we at least were, debating whether they actually were a top 4 team or not after the 4th place finish. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but yeah, I don't think either of us really felt that way about them, despite the placing. And now it's kind of looking like, that isn't the case. So we'll have to see. Maybe they're just that land team and they'll have another run on their hands in Miami. But obviously, if they start out in the losers bracket in Miami, they're making it their attempts to be a quote unquote land team that much tougher. So, yeah, I guess end of the day, 0-5 Minnesota, definitely wasn't expecting with this matchup. But 2-1 LAT despite the wins against Minnesota and Miami. Still got to see more out of them in the next couple of weeks before we go to Miami.
The big issue with Minnesota and how hard it is to kind of gauge where they are. So they've played 5 matches in these qualifiers. 4 have went to game 5. They have lost every single game 5. The only series that didn't go to 5 games in these qualifiers was a 3-0 loss to Atlanta to start this week. And Atlanta beat Toronto this week as well. So, I mean, obviously losing to LAT, they also lost to Boston. These two teams are not the top of the cream of the crop, so to speak. But still, they've lost 4 game 5s in a row in these qualifiers. I think that's kind of ridiculous. Maybe it's something to do with the team. Maybe that is kind of an indictment on the team construction or however they approach search and destroy specifically. But I don't know, like that feels like maybe it's a little fluky that they keep losing all of their game 5s. But maybe that's also just they're not that good of a team, and bad teams or not very good teams, if you want to be less harsh about it, those teams find a way to lose matches quite often. We've seen it with the Legion in the past. I think the Paris Legion, when they had that big losing streak, they had a bunch of like game 5 losses as well. That just kind of happens, but I don't know what to make of them. They definitely were not a top 4 team after Major 1, despite the placing. They're certainly not a top 4 team at this point. But maybe they'll be able to recover. They do have a few opportunities in the next week, I think, to kind of figure out things. Or no, they have one opportunity this week and then next week. But they might honestly go 2-5. Like their schedule sets them up to possibly go 2-5, but they also shouldn't have lost to LAT. Probably shouldn't have lost to Boston. So we'll see what happens. So that does it for our last week's matches. Only 8 matches last week. I think we have 9 matches this week. The pick'em so far. So you went 4-4 last week. I went 5-3. So we both got that Minnesota LAT match wrong. We both picked the Rocker. We also were foolish and picked against FaZe against the Ultra. We both picked LAG against Seattle. And you picked Boston over Vegas. I went with Vegas. So that was kind of the difference here this week. Overall, you are 55-30 on the season. I'm 59-26, and Tremor at a 0.000 win percentage. He is 0-1 on the year. So we have our pick'ems for this week, 9 matches, like I said, starting with 3 matches on Friday, March 8th. Starting with Optic versus Boston. Definitely not picking Boston, so I'm going to go with Optic.
I am too.
Atlanta versus LAT. As much as LAT has had a very good start to the Major 2 qualifiers, I will not be picking against Atlanta FaZe here.
I will not either. FaZe up.
And this one is more interesting. Carolina versus LAG. Both of these teams have been, kind of promising at points, also pretty disappointing at other points. LAG, they just lost to Seattle after Seattle could not win a control to save their lives. I'm going to have to go with Carolina just on that.
That's where my head's at too. I can't in good conscience pick LAT after losing to Seattle. Even in a world where we've seen like Carolina have these matches where they only win the search and no respawns, and against Seattle, technically Carolina beat them and LAG just lost to Seattle. So by that property, you got to kind of think Carolina here. So yeah, I'm going with the Royal Ravens.
Saturday, March 9th, LAG versus New York. If we're not picking LAG over Carolina, we're not picking against the Subliners.
We sure aren't. I'm going with New York.
Minnesota versus Seattle is more. That one's interesting. This is kind of what I was getting at with Minnesota, that they have Miami next week in their final match of the qualifiers. They have Seattle this week. Seattle has, a a pretty bad record in control, to put it lightly. Um, Without Illy, who knows how solid in search they are. They are not very solid in hardpoint regardless. I'm going to go with Minnesota, just thinking that that kind of late qualifier kind of surge for, kind of a pun there. But maybe they're able to finish out strong and get maybe 1-6, 2-5 heading into Major 2.
And I really have no clue what I want to do with this one. And this is the one I was teasing earlier where you said maybe I could pick Seattle and we're going to, put that to the test. And you still didn't want to pick Seattle here. Man, I really don't want to pick Seattle. And I'm, as much as I want to have something different than you, I just can't do it here. I don't. I think Minnesota's the better team, even despite recent results. So yeah, I'm going to go with Minnesota.
I mean, I think even I'd have to look at the win-loss stuff, like map win-loss, just from this stage alone. But I feel like Minnesota actually might have a better win-loss record. So Minnesota's
8-15,
and Seattle has actually a worse map win-loss. They are at a 31% win-loss. Minnesota has 35, but Minnesota has, obviously not won anything. I got to go with Minnesota. Just feeling like maybe just more consistently able to pull out like any game mode on a given basis. I don't think Seattle is able to do that very consistently, so I'll go with Minnesota. Last match on Saturday, Atlanta versus Boston. You put in notes slasher revenge game. I don't think it's happening. I mean, we got two former Atlanta FaZe guys with Priesta and Slasher going against their old team.
True. Priest has had his revenge games against Atlanta already, though.
But, it's maybe just with Slasher, it's kind of a bigger revenge game. I was still going to go with Atlanta, but maybe we can make that into a storyline.
That's what I was thinking. I'm definitely going with Atlanta still. They already taught me a lesson in picking against them, so I just definitely wanted to highlight that could be an interesting narrative from this matchup, though I don't see it playing out that way.
I have absolutely no idea about this next match. Sunday, March 10th, starting it off with LAT versus Vegas. All right. Vegas is, like you mentioned earlier, possibly having their best qualifier run in franchise history. Granted, that is a incredibly low bar to clear for this franchise, considering I would imagine they have the worst win-loss record in CDL history. Seattle has kind of turned it around over the years because they were definitely the worst in those first few seasons. But
you gotta think Seattle and LAG would be in contention, but both of them have won an event.
Yeah, I think just that Major 2 with LAG that 1 year, that might be able to clear them over the Legion, I think, because I think LAG might have gotten to champs like since they went to 8 teams. I'm not sure. I think actually Vegas and LAG might have never been to champs since they went to 8 teams because they both are really horrible franchises on a consistent basis. I'm going to go with... Oh, man, there's a sharp pain. I don't know. Who are you going with?
I'm going Vegas, baby. Vegas is winning champs. I'm on the bandwagon.
All right, I will get off the bandwagon. There's only room for one Ego Chall podcast host at a time. So I'm going to go with LAT. I don't have any idea what's going to happen because Vegas winning like this seems like we're setting up for, disappointment. Yep. But LAT winning like this also seems like they're kind of over their skis, for lack of a better term. So I'm going to go with LAT, but who knows?
All right.
Carolina versus Miami. I don't know. We have two. Why did they put 2 blow it up bowls? Or maybe Vegas is not in a blow it up bowl, but kind of like we'll see where we're going bowl.
It could have been worse. They could have put the Vegas, LAT, Carolina, and Miami, and those 2 matches with Miami and Seattle on the same day.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Miami is lost 7 in a row, I think is what I said. I'm just hoping for a Carolina win because I want to see Miami kind of break this streak. maybe as long as Real is not on a CDL roster, they can't win. So I'm gonna go with Carolina. Maybe that'll work.
Ooh, imagine we had a late week edition of Real, and then we have a Real revenge match already.
If Real comes in, my pick automatically swaps to Miami.
We will reconvene if they do make a roster change. I haven't heard anything.
I don't think so.
But it might be the first like rookie season revenge match in CDL history if it did happen at any point this year where Real comes in, because makes his debut on Carolina in the Major 1 qualifiers and then isn't able to play after that, and then gets another shot on another team and potentially gets to play against that same team he debuted on a couple months before. I can't think of any other scenario where that would even be possible, so it could be an interesting narrative.
Yeah, I have no idea whether that could be a thing.
Because like you think a lot of like, you know, someone like Fire who joined Paris like in his rookie year, he wasn't picked up by another team, right? So like I can't think of any rookies who really got picked up by another team in the same year off the top of my head.
Yeah, me neither. But then we do have a big match to finish out the week. Optic versus Toronto. I mean, you got to think that Toronto has, you know, a chip on their shoulder, especially after losing to FaZe. Optic has looked very strong in these qualifiers, but Optic is also known to kind of like have a few of the, like at least one letdown per qualifier, it seems, and I think it's probably coming here. Toronto is just, you know, I still think they're the best team in the world. They, until we see it at a major, they're the best team, and I think that, you know, the Ultra are the team to beat right now. So I'm gonna go with the Ultra.
Yeah, I'm going with Toronto too. I don't think I actually said it because we were joking around, but I'm going with Carolina over Miami too. I just can't, in good conscience, pick Miami right now at this point. So if that does play out the way with Carolina playing LAG and Miami this week, we both have them slated to go 2-0 this week, which would be a monumental week for the Royal Ravens, all things considered, and where they've been at this week there. So potentially setting ourselves up for failure and predicting them to go 2-0, so they'll go 2. But nonetheless, yeah, I'm going with Carolina in that one. I'm going with Toronto in the Optic one. Really excited to see that match just based on how the teams are both looking, and you know, could be another juicy one for some trash talk afterwards, and definitely in comparison to the other two matches on March 10th. It's a good thing we got this one to round out the day, because otherwise it could have been a day full of stinkers.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting because Toronto has been the best hardpoint team this season. Optic has all the tools to be a great hardpoint team just from a talent perspective, but they haven't really like put it together as well as Toronto has. And then who knows what happens in search and control. That's more of a toss-up in my opinion, even though Toronto, you know, until obviously the Atlanta series, had looked very strong in search as well. Control is kind of like an iffy one. That's their weakest game mode, but we'll see what happens when we get to Sunday. So those are the matches for next week. I think that about does it for the show. We're right over an hour so far. Thank you guys for listening and watching. We really appreciate it. Make sure to subscribe, follow, or like the feed wherever you're listening or watching on: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. We really would appreciate any support there. We were just talking about how we lost like 1 or 2 subscribers on YouTube, which is, you know, we're sad to see him go, but you know, that's just going to push us to go harder. It's going to motivate us to go into villain mode or something and become the best podcasters that we can be, or maybe we'll go after that subscriber's, you know, girlfriend, or we'll talk some trash to them at some point. But yeah, we appreciate the support. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, like the YouTube videos. I think you might be able to rate the Spotify thing, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks, at Presbyers. Podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. not entirely sure when the next show will be. Like it definitely won't be Sunday because I'll be out of town, and I'm coming back in town on Monday. So Monday or Tuesday night for the live show, which would be Tuesday or Wednesday morning for the audio version or the YouTube video to be uploaded. So expect it then. We will be talking about all of the matches that we just gave predictions for, and we'll be giving our predictions and thoughts on, I think, is it the final week of qualifiers?
Final week. Yep.
Thank God. We've been scraping by. We will finally talk about the final week of qualifiers, and then we'll have our preview show for the Miami major, the following week. So I'm just excited to get to a major and to be to a somewhat normal schedule for the CDL. So we'll be back early next week, and we'll talk to you then. That about does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys as always for the support. Hopefully, some of you listening who aren't subscribed to the YouTube channel can help out there, help us get our subscriber back and more, if you feel inclined to do so. But yeah, thank you guys as always, and hopefully, like Preston said, it's been a little slow with these qualifiers, but we're trying to do what we can with what we're dealt with here. So almost at another major, which is the good stuff. So thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chow.